Hey, what's up, Moto Buddies? Mike here from Taco Moto Co. We've got a motor on the bench, and we are going to do some maintenance videos here. We're going to talk about care and maintenance on this engine. This is specifically for the 450, 500, 501 class bikes, the Husqvarna KTM machines, and this is some of this may cross over to the 250, 350. We'll do that as a separate set of maintenance videos. So this is just for the single overhead cam engine, and we're going to do, on this first one, we're going to do oil change. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that you follow the service manual and good practices for changing the oil. So the first thing you want to do is get your tools ready. You're going to need a 13 millimeter. The 3 bolts that we're going to take off of this engine for changing the oil are 13. You could also use 1/2 inch if they start to get boogered out. So here's a little pro tip. I've had engines where you get these things rounded off. You get the bolts are rounded off, and then a 1/2 inch will go in there too. Ideally, you have a 13 available. 1/2 inch though, if you start to get some rounding. So pull these bolts off of the side here. This one's the magnet, and this is the oil screen for the engine. We'll remove those. This oil has already been drained out of this engine, so we're not going to have any oil come out. These things should be snug, but not extremely tight. The service manual tells you that you should be tightening the 2 screen bolts to 11.1 foot-pounds, and then this bolt here, this is the magnet, this one will go to 14.8 pounds. So even though I've pulled the engine oil out, I didn't do anything with the magnet, and so this will be the second oil change on this engine. And this is, you know, about normal, what you'd expect to see on a new engine as it's still getting broken in. This oil had 2 hours on it, so we did 1 hour on the first oil change, and then this is the second hour. And every consecutive oil change, as the motor gets some time on it, will get better and better. This is still, we're still breaking this motor in. Not unusual to see little flecks of metal. The first time we did the oil drain after the break-in oil, there were quite a few little shards and chunks and splinters of metal. At this point on the second oil change, there's none of that. That all went away. Now we've just got basically this sort of fine material that has gotten itself attached to the magnet. Again, pretty normal, not worried about it. So here you have the oil screen. Now there's 2 oil pumps in this engine. This is the one for the engine oil. Get yourself a set of needle nose, and you can grab this, and when you pull it out, one thing to note here is you've got an O-ring on both sides of this oil screen, and so you want to make sure that you don't pinch or cut that as you pull this thing out. And we've got some little bits of debris in here as well. On that first oil change, we had flecks of metal in here. Like I said, now we don't have any. We've just got some, just what I would consider very normal little bits and pieces of things in this oil screen. So to clean this, what I'll generally do is just hit it with a little carb spray, brake cleaner, and then some compressed air to blow the boogers away. And whether or not you hit this with canned air or shop air, doesn't really matter. The idea is you just want to blow that stuff off. You can run through the center of it as well. So we just want to get that thing cleaned off. Wipe this down. Let's talk about this copper crush ring for a second here. This copper ring here, when I pulled it off, I guess this is the second oil change, so it's been off once before. This is now the second time, and there's a little bit of a wear going on here on this one side. So what I'll typically do is flip it over and then maybe run it once or twice more on the back side, and then call it good for that one and replace it out. We'll put some part numbers for all these little items, and there's also an O-ring on here, and there'll be one on the screen on the transmission screen, the cap. So if you wanted to replace any of these things, if you needed to, you can do them individually or just have some of these on hand. What you don't want to have happen is to be in the middle of an oil change before a ride, and then you split something, you tear one of these O-rings, or you lose one, or just something happens to it, it's boogered up, and then you're stuck and you're trying to improvise the day before a ride, or even on a ride. You know, you might be on a long ride and have an issue with one of these. So I think you would be smart to have some of these screens, the O-rings, copper washers, all of this stuff, have it in a little baggie as a kit for your general routine maintenance. And then also in case you were on a ride and something went wrong, you could have these in a bag in a you know, you keep your spares with you. I don't think you should go as far as like keeping these on you for your ride. But if you're going on a ride where you're going to be changing the oil and then at home in the shop, you would do well to have some of these as spares. Okay, next up, let's talk about reinserting the screen here for, where's the hole? There it is. Reinserting the screen for the, this is the oil filter or the oil pump for the engine oil. And you'll notice in there, there's a little channel, there's a receiver down at the bottom end, and it's that circular receiver. That's where the O-ring for our screen is gonna fit right in there. At the bottom, you'll see there's a little oil channel where the oil is gonna come out. And all of that is basically flooded with engine oil. That's the shift shaft for the transmission right here. That's this rod going through the case halves is what you're looking at right there. And the transmission is on the other side, the clutch is on the other side. So the manual gives you a cool little trick about how to get that in there properly and get it seated. What they tell you to do is take and put your filter, or your screen rather, on, let's clean this off. This screwdriver might have some little boogers on it. Whatever you're gonna use as far as inserting this in there, just make sure it's super clean. And then what they recommend is that you slide this thing down in there and you kind of locate that cavity. And there is, you do run the risk of having this screen go in and not be really seated well on the end of that receiver down in there. And it could be cockeyed at a weird angle. So instead of it going, if this is the receiver where it needs to slot into, it is possible that you could miss that and it would be inside of the engine case, like sitting on top of it. And then when you go ahead and you install this thing on top of it, now you're just gonna crush this. And I've pulled engines, or I've pulled the oil screens apart and had this stuff all be collapsed and, you know, smushed in on itself because somebody didn't install this at the proper angle. And so the book gives you this great little tip about how to do that. They tell you to slide in something. Don't tell you to use a screwdriver, but that's what I do. So I've got this screwdriver here and I can positively feel that it's in that little channel. So now if I slide this in there, all I got to do is just make sure that that it goes in the O-ring. And so you cannot do that visually. If you don't have, you know, if you don't use a tool, then you're just sort of guessing, which is fine. Most guys get it right, but there are guys that will get that wrong and mess that up. The danger of not having a screen. So let's say what would happen if you're on a ride and your screen was damaged or you lost it or just some weird catastrophic thing. You can totally run your engine without that pickup screen. It just means that any little debris or material that might be floating around in the bottom of the engine, this is the oil sump of the engine, and so that oil pump is at a high rate sucking in this oil and pulling it into the pump. This is before the pump. The pump is like an oil vacuum pulling it up in there. So if you didn't have this screen on there, then some of that debris and material could be sucked up into the oil pump and then push through the passages and clog them. So it is not a good idea to run your engine without this screen in here. But if you had to in a pinch, you could, so you could get out of the mountains or whatever. But you're going to want to get a new one in there as soon as you can. So once you are sure that you've installed this at the correct angle, then this will go back in. You give this a little clean off. Make sure that the seating surface, all these mating surfaces are clean. And then what I will typically do is I will finger tighten this thing. I will hand thread it on for the first couple of turns. Nothing is worse than cross-threading something in a case, something super important. This is really important. And the other thing too that this lets me do, and I think this is probably a good way to go, is just hand tighten this thing on, because you want to make sure that the O-ring goes over the top of that and that nothing is binding. So again, my practice is typically I will tighten that all the way down until it's tight, and then I will come back with a tool, a wrench later, and tighten that the rest of the way. We've talked about our O-ring. Make sure that that little surface where that goes is clean. This is less critical because you're not inserting any O-rings or anything, but you do want to make sure you don't cross thread that. So once this is tightened, then the bolt here, this is going to go to 14.8 pounds. That's the magnet. This is really the drain bolt. These are the screens. This is the bolt. And then this one here, this is 11.1 foot-pounds. So they are different. If you needed to remember only one number, I would remember the 11. Tighten a boat to 11. I don't really care if you've under-tightened this by a few pounds, but it's more important that you don't over-tighten this one by a few pounds, because you've got this is steel, but you still could damage the threads. So if you were only going to remember one number, it'd be 11. You'd be okay to tighten both of those. So get your torque wrench out later and then tighten these both up. And directly underneath these two, this is the third. This is the transmission oil pump. This is the oil pickup screen for the tranny side. And this is just like the other one. This is a screen, and that one looks really, really good. I would not recommend pulling this off. I never do, in fact. There is a little snap end of this, sort of like formed to snap into a collar on the inside of this little area here. So I just always leave that on. O-ring, O-ring. So there's two O-rings here. Same procedure. Shoot that off a little bit with some spray. Hit it with some air. And you want to have these things dry. You don't want to put this back together with any of this carb spray in there. You want that carb spray to dry off. So not a bad idea to set these outside in the sun for a little bit. Let it all evaporate. Or if you're running shop air, just hit all this until it's completely dry, till there's nothing wet anymore on there. No liquid carb spray remaining. This one is much easier to install because there's just a simple little chamber up in there. Here you go. You can see you've just got this very basic simple chamber. That's where the other screen fits in. There's nothing to screw up here. There's no critical angles, and so when you drop this thing in, you can be really confident that you're not going to have any alignment issues. And the only thing to worry about on this one, again, like the other one, is just make sure that it's not cross-threaded before you tighten this one also to 11.1 foot-pounds. So let's talk about this little plug right here. Now the book has a big cross through this one. Do not remove this one in the oil change section. So let's pull this out anyway though, because a lot of guys will mistakenly think this is the drain plug and they will remove this. So this is the oil pressure bypass spring and ball. Basically what's happening here is if your oil pressure were to exceed the spring rate, there's a certain set of, so the spring is calibrated to set the oil pressure. And so the ball, the check ball that's sitting back in here, if your engine is in your bike and this is sitting upright, this ball will fall out and it'll fall into your oil drain. So here's the shock that a lot of guys will discover is they will remove this thinking that's a drain, and then this ball comes out, the spring comes out, it freaks them out because they've never had an oil change before where they had a ball bearing. And that is not what this is. This is not an oil drain. Again, this is the pressure check valve. So oil pressure through the passages, oil is being pressed against this ball through a small orifice. And then the preload in this spring allows a certain amount of bleed by, sort of bypass back into the crankcase. And the spring is calibrated to allow a certain amount of oil pressure to build within the engine. So if you ever remove this and you lose this spring, you must get another spring of this exact type. Don't go to the hardware store and buy a spring, because this is specifically calibrated for the oil pressure to be set exactly right on this engine. And anything other than that spring will change the oil pressure in your engine. It'll increase it or decrease it, and you won't want that. So if you ended up taking this thing out by mistake, make sure you have these parts. If you're missing any of these parts, you cannot ride your bike. You cannot put it back together until you replace these parts. So in order here, what you do is you're going to set the ball in. Now the bike will be, gravity is going to want to pull that ball out. So you'll have to hold it, I guess, with your finger, and then you'll have to stick that spring in there. And then you're going to have your gasket. I'm going to put this, I'm going to put it this way. Okay, there's the spring. And then the end cap. So you haven't done any damage. If you pull this off, no harm has been done, but it must go back together in that exact order and then re-torque this thing down. I'm not sure what the book spec is to tighten this, but you want it really good and snug. Time to change the filter. So you're going to use your 8mm socket here and pull out these two bolts. These are 6mm bolts, 8mm head, 6mm threads. Pull that out. Now this, at this point, there's a couple of ways to get this off. You might not be able, if it's been sitting in there a long time, it might be kind of tough to get that off with your fingers. So you could take this bolt, just barely stick it in there into the cap, and then you can use that as a little lever to just pop the cap off. You could also take a pair of pliers, and they put this little channel right in here. You could just grab that and yank it off with a pair of pliers. However you want to do that. There is an O-ring inside of here. Also make sure that that is intact, clean. It doesn't have any like burrs on it. It's also replaceable as a single component. So let's get this filter out. Now, there's always controversy about this, and I make some controversy myself. I will show you my method, my preferred method. Get it in there, expand it out, grab it, and pull it out. So that's an option. Somebody in our Facebook group had mentioned one time that they had these sprinkler. These are like a landscaping tool, and they've got this nice little kind of bite here on the end, and that works good as well for getting in there, grabbing it out. You can call me an animal if you want, and I'll accept it, but I tend to like to just take a screwdriver, punch a hole in there, Phillips, a little small one, and you can get in there and then grab the thing and pull it out. So there's any number of ways to get that thing out. Once you have it out, as far as the replacement goes, I like to keep a jar of a bunch of filters. This is just some kind of plastic bin, and I keep them soaking in oil so that I've always got one that's pre-oiled. Let's grab one that was down here in the oil, fresh. Okay. And when you drop this thing in here, you're going to get some oil as your bike sits upright. Let's kind of simulate that. As your bike is sitting upright, you're going to get a little oil that'll run out of the cavity here. And what some guys will do is as they insert this filter, they'll make sure, I think it's a really good practice that you make sure you've soaked your oil, your filter with oil. And whether or not you do something like I've got with the bin, or you just put it in your hand and you pour some oil into it and work it into the paper, doesn't really matter, but you want this thing to be pre-saturated. And once you pop this in here, you're going to shorten the time where the pump is running and pumping oil and then wetting the paper, and then it starts to flow out. So that's important. Another thing guys will do is they'll tip the bike over. So let's do that now. Let's simulate that. Now, if you tip it over on the side, you can dump oil into this chamber here, and it'll hold the oil. It won't drain out. And you might want to fill that up about halfway, and then you could stick a dry filter in there, knowing that if you fill it up all the way, you might have some oil overflow. So they'll drop a dry filter into this chamber, filled up halfway with oil, push this thing down in there, and then you could give your cap here a little bit of a clean. Make sure that that O-ring is on there. It doesn't have to be green, but the stock OEM one is green, and you want that to be intact and not have any burrs. You can pop that thing in there, and then this will be tightened to 4 foot-pounds. So that's very, very low torque strength. Do not over tighten these. We hear from guys all the time who will strip these out. And the only remedy here, let's talk about that for a second. If you happen to strip this thing out, your remedy would be you could put a time cert in there. That might work for you. Another option is some guys will, they'll tap this out from the 6 bolt to a 7 or an 8. I have heard of 7mm bolts. 8 is more common. When you tap it out to 8, you've lost. There's not a whole lot of meat here in the edge of the case, and so I think you're asking for trouble if you try to tap that thing out to 8. So really the best option here is to throw a time cert in there. Other guys I've heard they'll drill in farther and then send in longer bolts, and that's potentially an option. There is a little unthreaded material down at the bottom of that hole, but you run the risk of poking through the case and getting into something that you should not be drilling into. So you just need to be super careful when you tighten these. Do not over tighten. So it's time to pour oil back into our engine, and let's talk about a couple of different oil types, and then specifically let's get into the MA rating and what that is. So I've got 2 grades, 2 types of oil here from Spectro. This happened to be a good brand. I like these a lot. Spectro, the brand Spectro goes all the way back to Peyton motorcycles, when KTM, pre-KTM, when American KTM was still a Peyton, and Peyton partnered with Spectro and developed the Golden Spectro two-stroke oil product. So they've got a long history. Spectro brand has a long history with KTM, and so I'm fairly partial to them. You've also got the Motor X, which is the KTM recommended brand, sort of the in-house brand. Let's flip these over and look at the back and talk about this little tag here, this little MA tag. So any motorcycle is going to have, in the manual, it'll probably tell you two things. It'll probably first tell you to run the private label oil. So Honda does that, Yamalube, Yamaha. All the manufacturers have their own in-house chemical line of products and oils. And so they'll tell you first, they'll recommend run their own in-house. Why wouldn't they? That's more money for the manufacturer. Sure, no problem with that. The other thing that they will tell you, whether they do it overtly or it's implied, is that you should run an MA-rated oil. And this MA rating is, so GASGAS is a company that's the independent certification company in Japan. And Honda went to GASGAS, I think in the 90s, and asked them to develop a rating for wet clutch systems. Before then, all manufacturers had just recommended basically car oil. That's all that was available. And Honda was seeing some issues with clutch slipping, wet clutch performance. So they went to GASGAS. They wanted to develop a line of oils, a certification of oil that was for wet clutch bikes. And so GASGAS helped them come up with that. And so the Honda company and GASGAS together developed the MA rating, and now there's the MA2 rating, which is for bikes that have a catalytic converter. So this particular oil, this one is a catalytic converter safe oil. The other ones are not. And then there's another rating. There's actually a couple of GASGAS ratings, and you can look all these up, and there's one for scooters and a few other things. So basically, motorsports, two-wheeled machines, and power sports, the GASGAS ratings specifically kind of point to those, and wet clutch. Really, that's the key here. These are wet clutch oils. So all of these are MA rated, and you know that because they have the little shield here, and then there is a serial number. And so every bottle of every formula from every manufacturer, as it's tested, is given a serial number for that one bottle. So this grade of oil, the weight of oil, the blend of this oil exactly was sent to GASGAS. They tested it and they certified it, and they gave it a serial number. And that's the same thing that happened with all the rest of these. So if you're in doubt, you're standing at the oil counter and you're looking for an oil, and it says, if it says in the like the little blurb here that it's MA rated, and it doesn't have the shield, either the graphics guy at the company forgot to put that on there, and that was a big omission, because this is really proof. This is sort of the mark, the proof mark that it's a true GASGAS oil. In fact, you could go to GASGAS' website. Here's another way too. You go to GASGAS' website, you could punch in the serial number, and it will cross-verify that that really is a truly certified oil. They also have a PDF that you can go, and it will list, just break out every single, for any particular year, any oil and every oil that's rated, and that has the GASGAS rating. And so if you really want to get off in the weeds and get super nerdy about that, that's how you could accomplish that, to prove out whether or not your oil was GASGAS rated. Let's take a look at Rotella. So Rotella, on the back of their bottle, this one is the T4. They say that it's GASGAS and MA rated. And if you go on the GASGAS website, it's not there. Shell has not certified their oils. None of the Shell products have been certified through GASGAS for MA rating. However, Shell claims that they do, and how they do this, and I've talked to Shell engineers, I've emailed them, I've talked to them on the phone, and this is not an MA rated oil. It is not rated by GASGAS. And so, to be clear, again, if you go to the GASGAS website and you look at all of the oils that have been MA rated, Shell products are not in there, because Shell has never submitted this oil to GASGAS to be MA rated. Well, why did they say this? They self-claim it. So what Shell says is that they've taken this oil product, they know what GASGAS does to test oils, and then they've run this oil in-house through the same battery of tests, and it met the standard of a GASGAS rating, MA rating, without having it sent in and being fully certified. So what does that mean for you as a rider? If you run the Shell oil, then you have to trust that Shell perform the test to the satisfaction of you as the user of the product to meet the MA rating. And if you are, then go ahead and use Shell. Just know that it's not truly a JASO rated product. Is it an imposter? I don't know. Anybody can say, anything about their product and throw a label on there. I don't know that JASO may or may want to take legal action because it is not truly an MA certified product. I don't know. I don't care. That's not my deal. That's above my pay grade. But the Shell products, none of the Shell products are really JASO rated. They're not MA rated, although they self-claim it. So my final thoughts here on oil. I have yet to see in any of the work that I've done and do on bikes and all the research and reading that I do about these topics, I don't think I have ever seen a catastrophic engine failure due to oil. And that's whatever oil guys are running. And I follow some superbike and street bike sites, and there's a couple of guys out there who have been experimenting with some older Japanese bikes and running 99-cent store, no brand engine oil, and they're running them at super high revs, and they're pushing oil change intervals, and those bikes are running strong, and they've been doing that for years. So I think my final statement about engine oil is, I don't know that it totally matters for the durability and life cycle of your bottom end what oil you use. I think any oil, even generic Amazon oil or 99-cent oil, is going to prevent catastrophic bottom end failure. I don't think you're going to have crank issues. I don't think you're going to have crank bearing problems, tranny issues. I don't think you're going to have durability problems with any oil that you run. Where you get into issues of performance with the oil that you end up going with is those lower grade oils will end up giving you sort of clunkier shifts. They'll give you harder shifting, some false shifts. I've done a little experimenting myself with some of the Shell stuff and some of those 99-cent store oils, and the shifts are not as smooth, and it feels like there's just a little bit tougher engagement as far as clicking in, having the transmission click in. When you're running the better stuff, the true MA stuff, especially like really high-end stuff like some of the Moto products, Moto oil out of Germany, then the transmission is like buttery smooth, shifts are just really spot on and brilliant. You can find neutral easier on these KTMs. So is there an argument to be made that running a better oil gives you sort of a better ride experience and a little less top-end noise? Yes. Those are all true statements. But is it also true that probably any oil, even a generic oil, is going to work for the most part just as well on the bottom end? That's also true. I'd love to hear in your comments if you have any anecdotal experience or testing data that would show otherwise. But in my personal opinion, I think any oil you run is going to protect your bottom end. You may have some clutch chatter, you may have some clutch slippage, so there's going to be those potential issues and shifting issues. But as far as, if we're just talking about generic, is my bottom end safe? The answer with any oil is almost always going to be yes. Better oils will give you better performance in certain metrics. That is also completely and absolutely true. The other thing too that we're finding to be true is the fact that we can push and extend oil change intervals on bikes up to about 50 hours. And so I have no problem recommending a guy running one of the high-end Motor X or any of the other higher grade synthetic JASO approved oils into the 50-hour range when he's running like BDR type rides. And then guys who are doing their like hard enduro racing and then really wrapping out and doing some extreme riding, they probably need to be down in the 10 to 15 hour range. So how you are as a user and abuser of your engine oil, you're going to want to maybe self-select into one of those categories. Are you a 15-hour guy or a 50-hour guy? There's just really no way to give a flat recommendation. The book will tell you what it tells you, but that's based on sort of like racing parameters and ultimate protection. So whatever your comfort level is, I think you should follow that, whatever that standard is. And whatever oil grade and whatever oil brand you use, I just don't have a whole lot of opinion about that. So again, in the comments, if you want to flame up and tell us we're wrong, and that's fine.
The oil debate is endless. It will never be satisfied. But that's my thoughts, and those are our opinions on that. So moving on, as far as how much to fill, the book will tell you that you need 1.6 quarts, and that would be a number based on like a full oil change where you're doing a filter and you've done a full drain of the crankcase, the sump. And so it kind of varies. If you filled up a beaker at 1.6 and dumped it in, it may or may not be exactly right there. So what we'll typically do is I won't pre-measure any of the oil. I'll throw in a funnel and I will fill with the bike in the vertical position to halfway up in the window. And here's the little view window right here. And that's what the book will tell you to do, is to go halfway up here in the window. So I'll fill to half, I'll start it, run it for about a minute, turn it off. It almost always drops a little bit, and then I just top it up to half, and then off we go. If you wanted to, you could measure 1.6, that's fine. We don't do that. I don't really take the time, honestly. I just do that method I just explained. As far as the filler cap, you'll see that there's an O-ring on here. You want to make sure that that's there, it's intact. That's something you may want to consider replacing. Every now and then, maybe every 200 hours or so, take your fingernail and scrape that. And if there doesn't feel like there's any rubbery sort of like give to that, if it's just dry and brittle, I have seen these crack and split, and I've seen bikes running around without a gasket on here, without an O-ring, and that'll potentially put water and dirt in the engine, and then you'll have all kinds of like oil weepage and seepage here on the top. So if you're having that, it's maybe time for a new O-ring on the top. You can just get that again as a standalone part. If you're out, here's a little pro tip. If you're out in the trail and you don't have a proper plastic funnel with you, you can use a piece of paper. Just grab a piece of paper, and here, let me kind of simulate that right now with this. So you could take any old piece of paper, fold it up into like a little funnel shape thing right here. It's probably better if it's not folded, but this will work. Take your paper, make it into a funnel shape. You can tear off a little bit here at the end, and you now have an improvised funnel that will work super well if you're at a gas station and you don't have a funnel and you don't want to make a mess of trying to get your oil down in there. You can just do that, pour your oil in just like you would if it was a regular plastic funnel, and it won't leak, it won't rupture, nothing weird will happen, and then you just take that out and toss it. So that's a quick down and dirty pro tip if you need a funnel out in the field. So talked about the cap, filling it up here. Again, the tightening values, all the torque specs, I'll put those in the notes. I'll put links to the O-rings and the sizes for the O-rings and the copper gasket, the copper washer rather, for the drain bolt, all of that in the comments. This is just kind of a video here explaining how we do an oil change and some of the ways that you can do that. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe. Let us know if you think we're wrong in any way. We might be. This whole thing might be subject to lots of debate. We look forward to seeing it. Thanks for watching. Go out, get some adventure.